Welcome to The Empty Canvas, the podcast about how creativity begins. I'm the host, Pascal Anson, and today I'm joined by industrial designer Jon Marshall. Jon, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal.
Right, so I think I've interviewed lots of different creatives so far about how they start the process of designing. And I have a feeling today might be slightly different, talking about industrial design, because I'm guessing it's kind of more ideas based. And often I'm asked, where do ideas come from? And I think for many people that's really different, but I always struggle a little bit to answer that question. So I think we could hopefully get into that a little bit when we're talking about starting.
Yes.
And the metaphorical idea of the empty canvas when it comes to industrial design. Also, I'd really like us to discuss how industrial designers start, because I feel like with industrial design, also when you're starting out, there's one way of starting, and then as you progress through your career, that kind of changes.
Yes, it does.
And so those are the kind of the main things I'd like to talk about. If someone said to you, where do ideas come from? Where would you start, and what would you start by saying?
Well, I think that it's with industrial design. It's ideas based, but it's also a craft in a way. So, sometimes I work in a consultancy, so we have clients, and clients give us briefs, or sometimes these days they don't actually write briefs; they just talk. And so a brief might be a computer mouse. So there isn't really a new idea, or there's rarely going to be a new idea on a computer mouse. A lot of it is the sort of the craft of, what type of computer mouse is that? Who's it for? What's driving the creation of this? Is it sustainability? Is it portability and things like that? So, for me, a lot of the time, the initial idea sort of comes from interrogating why are we actually creating something new? Why does the world need this new thing?
That's really interesting. You started by that, because I always think about this idea of innovation, and innovation can mean something very different if you're a potter to somebody who's working maybe with emerging technologies.
Yes.
But there's still, notwithstanding, that can still be innovation in both those fields.
Yes.
But I always feel like with product design, with industrial design, innovation is kind of key, but not necessarily in always just like making new things all the time. Because we're definitely moving away from that anyway. We're moving towards it more as a society, but in some ways we're moving away from it.
That's true. I mean, the computer mouse is sort of one example on one side. Like at the other side, we do get briefs, and I did one a few years ago, which was a chai maker, where the brief was really open, and it was an open question. It was, people make chai, sort of spiced tea, in a saucepan, and it has milk and water and tea and spices, and it boils over. And would it be possible to make some kind of device to make chai as easily as you can make coffee in a mock coffee pot or a cafetiere? So in that case, it was an innovation and invention project.
And there's a problem to solve, isn't there? It's like problem solution. Yeah.
Problem solution. So, the only reason I'm setting it up like that is because
that's right.
With your question, there's actually different ways to start depending on what type of project it is. With the sort of designing a computer mouse, you really have to start with why are you doing it? Who's the user? What's the materiality that you're looking for, and sort of you're not reinventing the wheel.
No, right. But can I just go back and clarify what you were saying about the chai maker? So somebody has identified a problem, and they're coming to a product designer or an industrial designer, or even maybe sometimes an engineer, because I feel like there's some intersection with those things, and saying, we've got this problem, can you solve it? That could be the starting point, but that could also be the starting point for an engineer, couldn't it? As opposed to a designer.
I mean, yes, on that project we did work with an engineer, and he came up with some engineering solutions. It was like a palette of potential potential engineering solutions.
Mm.
But then the designer's role is then to look at those and say, like, you know, can that engineering solution ever be turned into something that somebody would want?
Yeah. Or would work in a kitchen, because if
Or
it's
work in
like
a
some
kitchen. Yeah.
hedron collider that
Exactly,
stops
yeah.
it boiling over, it's not going to be in your kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean,
But that's only one, isn't it? I just wanted to clarify, because I think this is a really good place to start, which is in terms of how industrial designers work. That's one thing, which is problem solution. But you've also touched on another area, which might be, this thing already exists. It solves the problem very well, which is computer mouse has been around for 40, 50 years. But now it's time for a different mouse, because technology has changed, how people use a computer has changed, materials have changed, responsibilities have changed. So is that innovation, or is that is that like another? Because I also feel like with those things where this thing already exists, let's relook at it. I think we were both taught to completely re-examine that object and not just do the next iteration, but say, does a mouse need to exist? How would you describe that process?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you work in a design, commercial design consultancy, sometimes you get those types of briefs where somebody says, you know, we're making this computer mouse, can you design a new one? And so you don't get to do the reinvention bit to dismantle it. You've got to say, like, do I think I can have a point of view on this? Can I make it better? Can I use less materials? Sometimes it could be invisible. Can I make, can I make it, more sustainable, better for the user, or can it work better for a specific user, for a gamer, or for someone who's traveling? So, like, in that scenario, to go back to your initial question, where does the idea come from? Like, often the product exists, so there is no blank canvas. What we do is we start collecting computer mouses and playing around with them and sort of trying them and try to see, like, why is this one better than that one? Why do we all hate this one? And you start articulating in words what is the intangible thing that makes this one better than this one, and then that gives you a sort of a recipe for a good mouse.
It also gives you a recipe for an intervention, because if you've articulated why that one's working, why that one's not working, you can identify the point of intervention where change can happen, I suppose. I really like this. You mentioned the gaming mouse, because I think that's also a really interesting point where a joystick is invented, and then maybe it goes onto the keyboard, and then the normal PC mouse integrates with the keyboard.
Yes.
But then that's kind of not working well, because that's how the technology of the game changed, and then the hardware didn't in that specific example, I feel like the hardware was lagging behind until somebody went, oh, gaming mouse, that's something that we need.
Yeah.
Because of habits and behaviours have changed, and now this thing doesn't exist in a good way.
Yeah. But I'm sure you've spoken to furniture designers, and so I think there's an aspect of industrial design which is like furniture design, which is like, nobody thinks it's strange to design another chair.
I thought you might say that.
And so nobody finds that odd, like, why do we need another chair, or where do you get the idea for another chair? But when it comes to industrial design, it's sometimes difficult to articulate, why do you need another computer mouse? But you often do need new computer mouses because different companies want to make them, or there is an opportunity for a gaming mouse, which is a practical problem, or it's just a slightly different flavour. Like, if you've designed the computer mouse I've actually worked on, it was because we were designing a computer and we wanted a matching mouse. So it was a materiality and form exercise. What do the furniture designers say about coming up with new chair ideas?
I would say that's not to do with the function at all, because it's a 425 high solid object you sit on. I think that's probably to do with manufacturing, to do with materials, to do with some sort of cultural, visual statement, new statement that something could make.
Yeah.
But that I think is a really good point, because I would imagine there's a lot more scrutiny on, like, why do we need another mouse more than why do we need another chair?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so I think this is giving me really good insight in terms of like another way that we could start as an industrial designer designing something. Could we go back to what you said right at the beginning about how a client might come even without a brief? Because I think those first two ways that we've talked about are kind of maybe brief led. I'm very intrigued about this idea of a client coming without a brief, because that feels like quite an uncertain empty canvas in terms of starting something.
Yes.
Could you maybe talk about how that goes when somebody comes without a brief?
Yes. I mean, when I say without a brief, I mean without a written. Like they haven't properly articulated the constraints and the criteria of the project, but they're coming with a project. So like the chai maker, they didn't have a written brief. They said, like, there's this problem to solve, you know, is it something you'd be interested in? And so, and then it's down to us to bypass the brief stage and just start working on the project. And to start working on the project, we normally just do a huge amount of talking with the client. We sort of, it's like group therapy. So because you sort of, and this is one of the key starting points for my work, is sort of just getting in a room and talking, and sort of, you know, ideas come up, and you say provocative things, because, you know, sometimes the reason it's a bit like group therapy is that sometimes you have to ask clients difficult questions, like, actually, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Or but, you know, that company already makes something very similar. What's your unique point of view? Or why did you, you know, why do you want it to, you know, you said you wanted it to be made of metal, but why metal? You're just making that assumption. So you have those kind of conversations, and what comes out of that is a sort of, you know, a massive lot of inputs, images, words, thoughts, and you can kind of put all that down, and then you no longer have an empty canvas. You have like a bunch of stuff to feed off.
Sure. Yeah. No. So that's kind of like building up not really world building, but it's building some sort of structure around maybe quite I mean, the chai maker sounds quite a specific problem, but it could be a much more abstract problem than that. And then you talk and you assemble lots of things around that to give it some sort of clarity, I suppose.
Yes.
Going back to that conversation, is that a bit like the faster horses conversation as opposed to a car?
Yeah.
When people were asked, I mean, this is a kind of classic, although it's automotive, I think it's a very classic, it really applies a lot to industrial design, which was when people were asked what they wanted, they said, well, we want faster horses.
Yes.
Because a car didn't exist yet.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if sometimes the client comes thinking, well, we just want you to design a faster horse. And you're like, no, hold on a minute. I don't think that's the right question to be asking.
I mean, that does...
Because that sounds really provocative.
That scenario does... That's like a dream project, isn't it? It's where they come and say, we want you to design a faster horse. And you're like, no, that's a dream. But that doesn't happen very often. I think what more often happens is they come and they say, we think there's this opportunity. People are asking for faster horses. We think there's an opportunity for a car. You go right through the process of designing the car, and at the end, they're unsure of themselves, and they say, we need to go out and ask the customers if they're going to buy this thing you've designed. Yeah. And they go and ask the customers, and the customers say, we want a faster horse.
Yeah, what is that? What's a car? What does that mean? Yeah.
And so that's the more common, sort of slightly painful scenario we see. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm starting to understand. I really like this thing of what you just said about the canvas no longer being empty when there's post-it notes and words and conversation and images and links and connections to the topic. I was also wondering something that we talked a little about earlier. Well, no, I suppose it's kind of the same thing as asking a client, responding to a client. I'm just sort of interested in this thing of, I suppose it is a little bit to do with the faster horses, which is about answering a question that somebody asks of you as a designer, as opposed to as a designer asking questions.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big, when I do workshops or work with students, I think that's a really, really big turning point where you learn to ask interesting questions as opposed to just respond to the questions that I've asked or that somebody's asked of you, where you like really question and analyze what you're being asked to do and go, that's not the right question, it should be this question.
Yes. Yeah, sort of rewriting the brief, basically.
How does that work?
I mean, for me, that's what we often do when we kick off a project. We have a sort of we've got a kick-off workshop. It's where we're getting all those words, and we don't use post-it notes, but we sort of it's words and images, putting up things on the computer, talking
with the client or without the client?
With the client,
right? Okay.
And that's where that sort of rewriting of the brief happens. That's where we're, they've asked us to design a frying pan. And that's where we're sort of saying, but who's it for? What's the unique thing? Who's the manufacturer? So it is basically a bunch of asking questions. I thought you were going to ask something else. I thought you were going to ask about designers who just independently come up with things, design them, and then sort of ask a question like, I've got an idea for a frying pan, and then go to companies. I don't do that type of work, but
right.
I wish I did. I greatly admire people who do that.
But I don't think maybe those are not connected, right? No, I think it's just somebody working for a company as opposed to somebody working independently, maybe.
Maybe, but I think independent designers do client work or self-initiated work.
I designed a frying pan for Alessi.
Yeah,
and
you're the type of person that I admire.
They didn't like it. They've got this like rating system where they rate it on all these different categories, and then you have to get a certain number, and if it's like 15 out of 20 and you should have got 16, they can it. So you could score really highly in one.
Yes.
If one just...
Did they tell you your score?
I think so. I can't really remember. But yeah, it was a frying pan, and I guess that actually was exactly what you're talking about. That was me identifying something and turning it into a frying pan, and then pitching it to a company that made homewares, as opposed to them, because they kind of said to us, just design. Well, somebody like Alessi, the brief is already set, which is homewares. So as an independent designer, you come up with something based on that shape of homewares. So I don't think you're going to design some textiles or a t-shirt.
True. But where did that idea come from then? That must have been a blank canvas in the beginning.
Yeah, that was, but for some reason, I think with that project, it was about thinking about, at the time, Alessi was a very, very strong homewares brand. And this idea of brand then went on to the literal idea of branding, and then got on to the idea of what if they could extend their brand by branding the meat in the grill pan? So it had Alessi backwards in the grooves, so it cooked the logo onto the meat.
Yes.
Which I thought was really good, and they were like, we hate this. Which I thought was quite funny, because it was, at the time, it was a brand that was really branding itself and had a very, very strong identity. But that's interesting, because obviously that was pushing that thing too far. It's like, we want a really strong brand, but not like that.
So that idea was a pun.
Yeah.
It was great.
But
they're mad not to have done that, aren't
well, maybe, but if it's a pun, that means that like it's got some sense of humour. And I think in
Yeah.
Italian, like I can imagine that landing really badly to Italians who are like wanting to take design really seriously.
Maybe, yeah. Did you take that to any other brands?
No, it kind of just. You know what was really cute as well? I made like a little branding iron because it said Love Alessi, so it was like on the meat.
Yeah.
And I made a little branding iron so that I could heat that up in the presentation and sear it into like a piece of fillet steak so they could see how it would work.
Fantastic.
Anyway, enough about me. But interesting that you're talking that topic of a company comes to an agency to ask for ideas as opposed to having an idea that you then
I mean
try and push
I sort of describe the way I work, it would be that I'm like a doctor who needs a patient. It's not that I couldn't come up with ideas. I can come up with ideas all day long.
How do you look? You can't.
Oh, that's what the podcast is about.
Yeah, you can't just say things like I come up with ideas all day long. That is exactly what the podcast is about. And I think to some people, they hear us say things like that, or now hear you say things like that, and that's not everybody can do that. I mean, I feel like I can come up with ideas all day long, but how do you do that?
I mean, I remember Ron Arad said once, you know, he said, like, I can come up with ideas all day long, but the difficult thing is turning the idea into reality. And that's triply true with industrial design, because it's like such a long and complex path from idea to reality. But so like rewinding, I can come up with ideas a lot, but for me, like, one of the things that validates the idea is that somebody is the sort of need. So, you know, like the doctor needs the patient and I sort of need clients to kind of come to me and say, you know, can you look at this? Can you work on this problem? And then the ideas come quite freely. But you know, when I'm just wandering around, I'm coming up with ideas for new things all the time, looking at things, thinking, I could do a better one of those, or like, why does why does this park bench not work? You know, but because nobody's asked me to sort of do it, I don't take those any further. And I admire people like you who can have an idea and sort of bring it up and develop it. I'm more needy. I sort of need somebody to, you know, a client to sort of also to pay me. This
isn't therapy, by the way, as well. You mentioned group therapy.
Yeah.
I hope this isn't going to turn into therapy of like, I can't help you with that. That's a you problem. But this thing of sitting on a park bench and thinking I can do a better one of these. Most people sit on a park bench and don't think that.
Yeah.
So what is it in you when you sit on a park bench that makes you starts thinking that the cast iron end isn't working as well as it could be because the timber is rotting through and it's causing the timber to be replaced, or the joint where the wood and the steel interface is not working. Like, why does that happen in your brain and not the rest of the population?
I think this is where we're probably quite similar, even though we operate in different practice in different spaces. Is sort of being visually triggered by things constantly. And so when you have a visual, I think I have sort of a visual memory, so I'm just constantly processing visual things and memorizing them and then combining them together. So one thing is just looking at, in this room, little joints and things, and thinking like, why is that like that? You know, and then once you start thinking, why is that like that? You think, oh, that could be, not only do you think, oh, you could do it differently, but then when you start thinking about something else, sometimes those things pop into your mind. Like I'm just rambling now, but I was following somebody who was wearing a really interesting jacket that had holes in it for ventilation for running. And I'm desperately trying to find what that jacket is. Maybe you can help, or maybe the listeners can help, because we're doing a project where we need exactly that detail, but it's got nothing to do with it. It's a technology project, but we need like a fabric with a detail. So a lot of it is sort of processing the visual world and then transposing it
to another context.
Which is how, I think that's how, one key way that visually triggered people come up with new ideas. As well as seeing problems in the world that need to be solved.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm thinking back to your education at the Royal College of Art under Daniel Weil.
Yes.
And I remember looking at the sketches that you guys in second year were doing, which is exactly that. I remember Carmen doing something to do with Mickey Mouse, and she kind of did almost like a morph from one thing, like Mickey, starting with like actual Mickey Mouse here, and then morphing it into, I don't know, a teapot or something on the
Yes.
or a radio on the other side. But it wasn't just that big jump to it was kind of putting it through different iterations and trying it out in different ways. So that jacket with the perforations might have come from a colander or a sieve or something else before
Yes.
that, and then becomes like a mesh or on a saddle or in a car seat or something.
Yes.
Before it becomes a jacket.
Yes.
And then you're looking at that and thinking, not, oh, that will be really good on my next run, but oh, how interesting that they've used that fabric in that way.
But that perfect little detail, so that's why when if I don't teach students, but I sometimes do talks with students, and that's why I often say, like, if you're designing a clock, don't look at clocks. Go and look at gear knobs in cars. Go and look at frying pans. Look at other things, and sort of you'll find it much easier to come up with some sort of starting point. If you just look at clocks, you'll just be iterating on clocks, and you can do that later on when you need to sort of.
Oh right, that's interesting.
When you need to sort of get the clockness, you can bring the clockness in by looking at clocks. But to start, maybe it's better to think about other things. And if you think about designers that we greatly admire, like Achille Castiglione, that's exactly what you can see evident in his final work, that he
looks at tractors.
He looks at tractors. Yeah.
Okay, so that's excellent advice. When you're starting to design something, don't just go to a catalogue of what already exists.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
I think lots of people know that, or some people know that, but then that thing of looking at tractors that takes some confidence to know that by looking at tractors, you're going to be devoting your time to something that's worthwhile. Because I think you could say that to somebody, go and look at a tractor, and they'd be like, well, I'm not looking at tractors, I want to design a clock.
Yeah, true.
I think
maybe tractor to clock is too much of a jump, though. But if you're, for example, going back to my earlier example, we're designing a technology product and we need some ventilation in it. So instead of that's where I started looking at a running jacket, which was a fabric which had really interesting hole pattern, rather than looking at tractors or cars. Which
okay, so
that's what I mean. Yeah.
All right, great. So I think there we can be a bit more specific. So we go from this technology, this hardware needs ventilation, but we're not just going to look at other technology that has ventilation. We're going to look at all types of ventilation, from running jacket to wind farms to, I don't know, blowing bubbles through like a hole to make washing up liquid through a hole to make a bubble or something. Okay, so then I think that shape of those things that you look at, that's where kind of intelligence comes from in design, because that's about those interesting connections that are not so far removed to the tractor that's sort of a bit irrelevant. But once you have those things of, okay, let's think of 100 types of ventilation, it gets really hard after 10, because the first 10 are kind of everyone knows. The next 10 is a bit of head scratching, and then you start really digging into like lateral versions of ventilation that somebody will go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. A dandelion, when the wind blows, that's kind of got something to do with ventilation. Actually no, maybe that's sort of outside the shape. So you kind of, I always see it, like what's inside the shape, what's outside the shape, and then what's on the border of that shape. And I would say something like ventilation, dandelion isn't outside, but it's not really ventilation, it's something else. But it might be useful when we're coming to look at something. Yeah,
I mean, nature is always a good inspirational point. I mean, Jay Oscarby, so I used to, before Pentagram, I worked at, ran a company called MAP, which was part of a group of companies that Edward Barber and Jay Oscarby set up. And Jay, I just remembered he always said, it's good to be a bit of a magpie. You know how magpies fly around and pick up like random shiny things and take them to the nest. It's that part of magpie behaviour he's talking about, not the
good luck, bad luck.
It's just sort of surrounding yourself with objects or having that. I mean, maybe not everybody has like the kind of visual memory, but then surround yourself with objects and be interested in objects.
My colleague Michelle always says that it's to do with connections. So ideas come from connections, and the ability to connect one thing with something else, which you can kind of justify and you can see that connection, whereas somebody else can't see it.
Yes,
or
exactly.
maybe the client can't see it. And I think it's our job as designers to say, well, connect these two things together.
Yeah.
And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work.
I think that's probably at the centre of it. That is the smartest description of it I've heard. Connections.
It's quite
simple. Get Michelle on this podcast.
it's quite simple, isn't it? Because I think everybody can make connections and everybody can join two things together, whether it's figuratively or literally joining something together. I suppose with design it's figurative. It's the ability to link two things that makes an interesting A plus B equals this other thing.
True. I remember something else you mentioned, which is sort of progressing through a career. So my career now, I'm running a team. I have 6 designers working with me, and whereas before I was a designer, working for other people.
You were one of 6.
I was one of 6, yeah. And so the connection thing is the first part of it, isn't it? But then, and I think everybody's got that ability, but then part of design and art and making is the being able to judge then, is this a good idea?
Yeah.
And I think where do ideas come from is one part of the challenge. Recognizing a good idea
is the next bit.
Because if you can come up with lots of ideas and there's different processes, and we talked about some of them, then you're awash with ideas. Where do you focus your energy?
Yeah, which one do you how do you edit that process of coming up with lots of things?
Yeah.
Where do you see the potential in that idea as opposed to that idea?
Where do you see the potential, and then because then you've got to, particularly in industrial design, you've got to invest a lot of time to sort of take that forward. And so one of the big differences is, when earlier in my career, I was the one, coming up with ideas or developing, doing sketches and throwing them up. Now, I do that, but I've also got a team who also do that. And part of, I think, when you're leading a design team, part of your role is to help with the editing process, so that the team focuses in the right way. So a good proportion of my time is spent, going around, killing off some things and sort of nurturing other things. And so when you run a team, sometimes I have the answer. Sometimes it just comes to me, but like, I think we should approach the project in this way. But sometimes I don't really know how we're going to do the project, and that's where it's really great to have a team, to create an environment where the team can be creative and through process of discussion, sketching, finding images, talking, making, we produce material, and then it becomes clearer to me, which path to follow, or we decide what to show the client. Sometimes the client shows. That's a big change. I think for designers early in their career, often they're doing one of two things. They're working on somebody else's idea, so somebody said, I've got this idea, I need you to draw it up and work it out and make it. Or somebody has said, we've got this brief, come up with some ideas.
Yeah. Okay, so can we go through these stages a little bit? Because I'm curious to know, as an industrial designer, at each of these stages, from kind of intern, junior designer, midweight designer, senior designer, now partner, what your empty canvas looks like. Because I think that's quite valuable for people to understand, that you just, this thing that you were saying just now about working with a group of people, because I think sometimes also you need to work on something to a point before you realise that's not the right thing to be working on. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to see something through that. You've maybe got a hunch of like, I'm not sure this is the right thing. There we are, I proved it's not the right thing. So now let's work on the right thing.
Yeah.
And sorry, that's probably a bit of a sideline, but I think what I'm saying is sometimes you start on something and you work, and then you think, hang on a minute, this isn't really what we should be working on. We should be working on something else. But that's all, again, trusting the process and being part of that process of design. I very rarely get things right the first time I try it. I have something, I try it, it's not quite what I thought, and then I start again, and like it's generally better the second time.
Yeah. The question for you first, to frame that though, are you somebody who, when you, so say you started drawing or something, or you're making something, are you somebody for whom it goes to a kind of a bad place, but then if you persevere it becomes really good, or does stuff always look good for you?
That's really interesting, because I had this exact same conversation on this series of the Empty Canvas with an illustrator, and we were talking about getting past this. So for her, the empty sheet is an opportunity to produce an illustration. And we were talking about sabotaging that sheet, first of all, by either crumpling it up or putting down some colour, or by putting down lots of mess and then clearing up the mess.
I see.
Or working with the broken texture. And I think that's sort of interesting, isn't it, if we overlay that onto industrial design?
Yeah.
Because as an illustrator, or if you're doing a drawing, that's a way to kind of get over the first nerves of like, well, it's already broken. And I love fixing stuff, so I'm gonna fix this drawing. I think to your question about how sometimes I work, I love fixing a problem. So, and sometimes it is good to kind of start from something that's broken, or break something, not start from something that's broken, break something up and then reassemble it. Because that can also be a bit like what you talked about, like pulling something apart and then putting it back together again differently. Yeah. I know you were talking metaphorically, but I think we can also talk about it like quite practically.
Quite practically, yeah.
I don't know if that, I don't think that that doesn't totally answer your question.
No, but I think if you, let's say you're an illustrator and you start on that process, so that then the work to create the illustration creates the end artifact.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I was asking that is I think one of the things I've noticed, particularly with younger designers, is if you're designing something, you're doing a sketch of something. So the sketch isn't the artifact, the sketch is the process. And I always think there's a temptation to give up too early. So whether you're sketching, this is an industrial side, whether you're sketching an idea, or whether you're doing a physical model of it in card or something, or whether you're doing a computer model, computer rendering, I think there's the temptation to give up too early, because you kind of get to the point and you say, well, I've judged this and it's not a good idea. But I think actually the real learning comes from finishing that to even if you think, oh, it's not the right idea, it's finishing it to a higher level, completing it. Because sometimes it's in that, because I definitely do have that thing where I sort of halfway through a sketch, I think, oh, it's not looking good. But then if you just push forward and you finish it, you sometimes get the learning from the second bit, and sometimes something comes out of it that you didn't expect. And I think that was one of those things that we were taught at the Royal College of Art when we were studying under Daniel Weil, was that sense of like, you know, the sketch or the process, actually, if you just trust it and you kind of engage fully in it, you will sort of something interesting will come out of it. And so in industrial design, you know, often we do, it's a kind of a bit of a trope, but you know, when your client comes for a project, you might do 3 concepts or 5 concepts.
Yeah.
And so often, often that some of those concepts are not quite right, but I think there's a
we really
real
love
value.
this one. Let's do 2 of these so that they pick up.
Well, that's one technique, but the other technique is to sort of just say we got some learning out of the 5th concept. So, and we're going to and it's brave to show it to the client. Obviously, you don't want them to pick it, but it also frames what you're not going to do. And I think there's a discipline in kind of finishing those things to a level. Yeah, and that's also addressing the sort of empty, like it's addressing the half empty canvas problem.
It's addressing the starting, isn't it? Because I think what you're asking is about, you're asking about perseverance with ideas, and like when you stop and when you like then go back to square one or the empty canvas again. And I think that's very interesting what I'm hearing, which is, but I think that's a very personal thing, because we know that there are some people who give up really early, and some people who are really tenacious and they'll hold on maybe too long on a project, and even when they know it's not working, and like flog it to death. But I think that is an interesting point about when you start something. Well, first of all, it's like knowing the potential in that idea that you're starting, because sometimes you don't know that idea until you take it through all the stages you talked about: model making, rendering, testing, all those things. And even if it kind of fails at the end in the test, you take some of that learning back when you start again. And you think, okay, well, that path that we took didn't work out well, but we've now got another chance to try this out.
Yes.
With all that information, that we're not going to use everything, but we learned some really good stuff from that last time we tried it. Yeah, I think I think that's a good sort of question for designers to ask themselves about how you personally manage work and a project. But also, you know, we started off this by talking about groups of people, or how when you're in a group or when you're managing a group.
Yeah, I think that was just a roundabout way of coming back to like when you're early in your career and you sort of go into, let's say in my case, into a design studio, you don't know what the hell you're doing, you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, and you don't really have the awareness or the capacity. Well, I didn't. Some, you know, there are lots of very talented people who did, but for me, I sort of I got lost, and sort of my way out of that is, you know, just start doing something and do it to a really high standard, because even if it's not the right thing, you've done it to a really high standard. And if you can't do something like make a tool, or, you know, sharpen the pencils to a really high standard, do you know what I mean? It's sort of like, if you just persevere, but I mean, maybe that's my personality and I find that easy to do, and I get that some people wouldn't find that easy to do. If you're talking about at the beginning of a career as an industrial designer, what you're saying is somebody else comes to you with, can you do X, Y, and Z? So they're telling you how to work and these are the ideas we want to work on, and we need you to make a model, do a drawing, do a rendering, do a technical drawing, whatever it is. So somebody's telling you how to fill the empty canvas. How does that change, do you think, as you kind of progress out of that era where you're an intern or you're a junior designer, to having a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more responsibility? Yeah, it's probably, that first part is probably really tough. Then the next tough part is when you rise through your career to the point that you're responsible for other people, or you're actually the one who's responsible for coming up with the idea, delivering the idea, charging money for it to a client, and you know that's extremely difficult. Then at some point you get to like my position where I've got a really great team now, so even if I don't know the answer, I never admit it.
Hopefully one of them do.
Hopefully them. So, but that sort of middle bit when you maybe first into a leadership position, I think that is extremely difficult, and I think that's why, you know, it's probably important to listen to this podcast and find out how people come up with ideas, you know, because you by the time you reach that point in your career, you need to know how to do it. You need to have your techniques to do it.
But
Like,
also
it's
you need
no
to
different from
understand how other people work and how other people, because not everybody generates ideas in the same way.
Yeah.
And I suppose as a leader or a manager, you need to identify how people generate.
Yeah.
Because obviously you don't have exactly the same type of person in the team. You have different types of people.
Yeah, you need to know how to.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were in the middle.
You need to know how to create an environment to make other people productive and successful.
Yeah.
Which is also not that easy if you've previously been in a competitive environment where you're kind of competing with other people, and then suddenly now you're managing or you're leading other people. You have to make them thrive to make yourself look good. Sometimes there's strange dynamics there. Yeah. No, I was just thinking, like, when you're like, if you're taking it outside of our creative profession, if you're working in if you're a chef, for example, and you you rise up through the ranks, presumably it's the same, right? When you become a head chef somewhere, suddenly you're responsible for a whole bunch of things, budgeting, responsible for other people. There's a lot of pressure. But you can always, I assume then you can always go back to your craft, you know. You can, and it comes back to that thing of, like, you just make a really good lasagna or whatever, and that's what I mean. Is like, if you can go back to sort of making it like a really beautiful sketch, or just being really good at model making, you know, when you I'm sure you've seen it, if you can sell an idea with a beautiful model or a beautiful sketch or a beautiful drawing, or with words that are carefully crafted.
Yeah.
Just taking the time and care over those things. It's not about how to fill the empty canvas, but it's once you've started working on that canvas, you've made that first mark, then it's how to elevate that to something fantastic. And your question is also probably interesting, is like, at what point do you decide to throw that canvas away and start again? I don't know, that comes with experience, or with it's easier to do it with experience, but part of it is instinct, and some people are.
I think the last thing I was going to ask you about, actually, you just started to touch on there, which is about, in terms of starting and generating ideas, I wonder if we could just briefly talk about the difference between quantity of ideas and one idea. So kind of quantity versus quality. Because I think, and you touched on it a little bit before, where you were saying you would present 3 or 5 options to the clients, and they've come from 25 options that you've discussed as a team.
Yes.
How important is the relationship between quantity and quality as an industrial designer? It's kind of quite a big question to conclude on, but I do want to talk about that, because I think it's something that I'm sort of interested in terms of what we've been talking about so far.
I mean, I think that's a matter of sort of personal taste and how your practice works. Because I've got a Pentagon, which is a partnership structure, and other partners very much believe in the idea of taking the client through a strategic process to one idea. And on that journey, there are other ideas, but it's all about delivering one idea. But that's not my process. My process is taking opening the book a little bit on the process and showing the client several ideas. And I think it's very important, if you're going to show 3 ideas and you're going to have a discussion with the client, you need to be prepared to go forward with any of those 3.
Right.
If you're only prepared to go forward with 2, you have to say to the client, I'm showing you 3, but we can't do the 3rd one, because you can't leave that to chance. If you leave it to chance, they'll always choose.
That's such a tease. What was the 3rd one?
Well, you have to, you sort of have to say, like, this is flawed because, but we wanted to show you, like, that's the danger of going in that direction. So I'm more.
So you might show them the third one.
I would, yeah.
And say, this is why we're not doing the
Yes.
first. Wow. Okay. That's quite brave.
So I lean more towards the quantity personally, because
Yeah.
I find it more interesting to bracket the things that we should do with things either side.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I do that? It's from experience that in the industrial design process, what often happens is towards the end, I think I touched on it right in the beginning, towards the end, sometimes you get to that point where clients have to then massively increase the investment to go into tooling and manufacturing. And they quite rightly get nervous and get the wobble at that point. And at that point, they'll often get this thing of like, wait a minute, why didn't we do one that was like, why are we doing all cube-shaped things? Did we ever look at one that was a cylinder? And so if right in the beginning of the process, you have done the cylinder one and you've said to them, we can't do the cylinder one because it makes getting past that wobble thing a bit easier. That's my process. But as I say, other people do it by building up a much deeper, stronger sort of strategic approach.
Yeah.
Or you can do it with storytelling. You can sort of start the process with storytelling. That's another way to start this.
Yes, yeah.
It's just to come up with a story. So a good example of that is when I was working with Ed and Jay, the 2012 Olympic torch. You know, before we really designed the object, we came up with this really strong story about that it had to have perforations, and it had 8,000 perforations because there were 8,000 torch bearers over 8,000 miles, and that, you know, that was a reason for making this perforated form, which was a form that we thought would, you know, look good, look interesting, be lightweight, you know, please.
So there was no point where they're going, sorry, why are we going with perforations again?
Exactly. And then from that point onwards, everybody bought into that story. So at the point that the manufacturer's like, oh, you know, it'd be much cheaper if we only did 6,000 perforations, you know.
No.
It's like, no, you know, so you bought it. So that's one way to...
that was baked in.
Baked that in.
Yeah, right, early, yes.
Baked that in.
Yeah, good. Just before we finish, I've got some general either or questions for you to take us to the end. So when you're designing, would you use pencil or marker?
Neither. I actually use a fountain pen.
Oh, nice.
And with black or blue ink. Yeah.
Analog or digital?
Starting, it's always analog in the sense that it would be, pen, writing, pen. Speaking, sketching.
Yeah.
But you just want either or, so.
It's tempting to like, I know that. Monochrome or colourful?
A monochrome, yeah.
Big sketches or little sketches?
I think it would be what you would call little, as in A4 size.
Okay. So lots of little sketches on an A4?
Maybe like, 6 or 7.
Oh god, yeah, little sketches, definitely. Loose sheets or pages in a sketchbook?
Sketchbook for me.
Okay. Keep mistakes or bin mistakes?
Keep them if they're paper, but if they're... Yes, keep them.
Okay. Think then do, or do then think? This is my favourite question, actually, to designers.
Think then do, or do then think. Probably for me, think then do, but I would definitely see it earlier in my career. It would have been do then think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Creative chaos or calm order?
Creative chaos.
And background noise or silence when you work?
Background noise.
Finished or never finished?
Never finished.
And lastly, up early to finish something or all-nighter?
Again, that's changed. So now it's up early, but it was, for a vast proportion of my career, it was all-nighter.
Okay, very good. Jon Marshall, thank you very, very much. Great.
Thank you, Pascal. Yeah.
Thank you to my guest Jon Marshall on this episode of The Empty Canvas. Please like and subscribe, and maybe send this to somebody you think needs a little bit of a nudge on their own creative journey. I'll see you in the next episode.